Greetings. Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. David Walton, the Director of the Global Black Studies Program at Western Carolina University and Assistant Professor of History. And you're joining us for our Global Black Studies second installment of the Black History Month webinar, and it is part of our webinar series. And I first want to give thanks and acknowledgement to the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Nation, whose ancestral land Western Carolina University has the privilege of being a guest in. And I think that's important because we're talking about the Haitian Revolution today, and the Africans who successfully waged that revolution took it upon themselves to actually name their new sovereign nation after the indigenous peoples of the island of Santo Domingo, today known as Dominican Republic and Haiti. And we have the privilege and honor to be joined today by Dr. Crystal Nicole Eddins, Assistant Professor of Africana Studies at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. But those of us who spend time in East Lansing sometimes we'll call it Charlotte. That's an inside joke for those people back home watching. It's Charlotte, but they want to be fancy, so they call it Charlotte back home because we have a town named Charlotte. Nonetheless, this is an important topic. It's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. And the Haitian Revolution is one of only two successful slave revolts in the Atlantic world. And it had a great impact on the Atlantic world. So I am honored, and it is our privilege to talk with Dr. Eddins about our book, Rituals and Runaways, which discusses in details and researches the Haitian Revolution, but from new and exciting and nuanced ways. So thank you for joining us today, Dr. Eddins.
Hi, Dr. Walton. Thank you so much for having me. And good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm really happy to be here to share a little bit about my work, especially for Black History Month. So I give, a great thanks to you and to the Western Carolina University Global Black Studies Program for bringing me here. As Dr. Walton mentioned, he's a colleague and friend from our graduate school days at Michigan State University. So it's exciting to see what's happening here with the program at WCU. So if it's okay, should I go ahead and get started?
Yes, ma'am. You are the star of the show.
Oh, I think I need the screen sharing.
Okay, hold on. Let me take care of that right now. Let's see. Awesome. And you should now be able to screen.
Okay, cool. Sorry, I've got two screens going on here, so I'm trying to make sure everything is in working order. All right. So just to give a brief overview of what I'll talk about today, I want to just give a brief overview of my research agenda, and then I'll discuss some of the highlights from my most recent project, my book, Rituals, Runaways, and the Haitian Revolution, Collective Action in the African Diaspora, which we recently published with Cambridge University Press. And then if we have time, I'll discuss some smaller publications that are forthcoming, as well as in some earlier stages of development. My research sits at the intersections of the fields of Black and African diaspora studies, historical sociology, and social movements. I'm broadly interested in the ways that people of African descent, both in the past and in the present, the ways that they mobilize themselves to oppose and transform regimes of racial oppression and economic exploitation associated with the capitalist global economy. More specifically, I've been interested in the ways that Black communities develop collective consciousness, a shared identity, and cultural and religious expressions to generate their social movements. So my work is interdisciplinary. I embrace concepts and perspectives such as Cedric Robinson's ideas of racial capitalism and the Black radical tradition that describe how capitalism expropriates Black people's labor and life value and the opposition that arises from the contradictions in the world economic system. I draw on social movement scholarship to explain how Black people create autonomous, liberated spaces through their social networks, and then how they develop tactics and tools to navigate repression and other challenges within their lived reality. And finally, in the case of Haiti, I argue that sacred ritual practices and the social and economic formations that existed within Maroon communities or runaway slave communities, that these form the foundation of what decolonial sociologist Jean Casimir calls the counter-plantation system, these lifeways that developed organically among the self-liberated masses during the years after Haitian independence. So in the late 18th century, colonial Haiti, or French Saint-Domingue, was the most valuable slave colony in the Americas. It was the world's leading sugar producer, and by mid-century, it was a leading coffee producer. Saint-Domingue also was the deadliest slave colony. Early sources estimated that nearly 1/3 of newly arrived Africans perished after 5 years. So as opposed to being a society with slaves, this was a full-fledged slave society in which most, if not all, social institutions were organized around maintaining powerlessness among the enslaved population. In sugar colonies especially, sociologists have referred to enslaved people as being, quote, socially dead, or being completely alienated from their labor value, from having any type of authority over their daily lives, their kinship ties, cultures, or identities. Enslaved people in colonial Haiti were indeed subject to radical forms of torture and violence. But in such a repressive society, then how exactly did they organize the most successful slave rebellion in modern history? So this is a big question that most scholars would suggest has several answers. Right? One response would be that the French Revolution provided the philosophical revelation, as well as a window of opportunity for the enslaved population to rise up against their owners in 1791, eventually culminating in Haiti's independence from France. More recently, others have begun to take seriously the political and cultural contributions of the enslaved masses whose worldviews were shaped by their African origins. So I situate my work within this latter body of research by centering people of African descent and their worldviews through the lens of their pre-revolutionary sacred rituals and patterns of marronage, or escape from bondage. So my book, Rituals, Runaways, and the Haitian Revolution, published this past year in November under the Studies in the African Diaspora series with Cambridge University Press. The book's central argument is that the web of networks between African and Creole runaways, enslaved people, as well as a small number of free people of color that they built through rituals and marronage, were a key aspect to building the racial solidarity that made the Haitian Revolution successful. Shared African ethnicity among insurgent bands was important for them to cultivate trust by employing common languages, political ideologies, or religious orientations. However, this book also shows that in colonial Saint-Domingue, racial solidarity, or what I would describe as cooperation among enslaved individuals beyond their cultural, linguistic, or political boundaries, was also increasingly important in an aspect of collective consciousness. So I explicate collective consciousness as well as racial solidarity by exploring the complicated relationships between groups that previous generations of historians and scholars have previously believed to either be politically or socially opposed to one another, or just otherwise uncooperative. So for example, there are these kind of divisions in the ways that historians write about enslaved people and Maroons, these divisions between Africans and Creoles, and divisions between short-term or petite Maroons or long-term or permanently escaping Grand Maroons, right? But I try to problematize these dichotomized categories of human actors and present a broader conceptualization of their stages of participation in resistance activity, especially by, again, highlighting the ways that they were cooperating and collaborating with one another. So in addition to secondary source literature, funding from the National Science Foundation, Brown University, the African American Intellectual History Society, and UNC-Charlotte allowed me to conduct archival research at several libraries, including the National Archives of France in Paris and in Aix-en-Provence, the John Carter Brown Library, the Library of Philadelphia, and the Schauberg Center for Research in Black Culture. Some of the documents that I've looked at include letters from planters and colonial officials reporting on conflicts with Maroon groups. There were court rulings against ritualists and other rebels, and planters' records that at times made mention of runaways in their account books. I also looked at travelers and observers' accounts, primarily Moreau de Saint Marie's several volumes from 1784, 1796, 97, and 98, describing life and laws in Saint-Domingue. Information from the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database also helped to provide and frame the pre-revolution resistance within the context of colonial Haiti's growing African population. And lastly, I did content analysis of runaway slave advertisements that were published in colonial Haiti's newspapers, which I will discuss more soon. So the book is organized into 8 chapters with 3 major parts that explore how collective consciousness is, number 1, shaped by history, culture, and other social forces. 2, the way that consciousness is reinforced by shared social conditions, common experiences, and processes of interaction. And number 3, how it informs and guides collective action. So again, the project is an interdisciplinary case study that takes a Black and African diaspora studies perspective to systematically investigate the ways in which enslaved people consistently transgressed colonial power structures through their pre-revolution collective actions. Collective action is any activity that brings people together for a common purpose, usually to solve a problem. Consciousness is a foundational aspect of collective action because it heightens understanding of the reasons for taking part in resistance activities. Shared consciousness also requires comprehension of injustices and inequalities within a material context and having common interests with others who share positionality. So I draw on sociologists Alden Morris and Naomi Brain's claim that politicized consciousness is raised through interactions in free spaces or social zones that are removed from the control of dominant groups and produce the cultural and political agendas that precede or accompany mobilization. Over time, groups develop a repertoire or a collection of resistance actions that are longstanding, effective, and distinct to their particular context. So a Black studies and African diaspora studies perspective is particularly suited for understanding shared consciousness and collective action in colonial Haiti, because of the 500,000 enslaved people in the colony, 2/3 of them had been born and raised on the African continent. So according to scholars like Ruth Sims Hamilton and Michael Gomez, the social networks, spiritual and cultural practices, and ideological tools developed within enslaved communities form the basis of their struggles for freedom. So I give particular attention to social ties and other oppositional behaviors as part of consciousness-raising interactions. My research contextualizes these interactions, such as African-inspired rituals and forms of resistance like marronage through the lens of participants' sociocultural understandings of themselves, each other, and the social institutions that shape their lives. The centering of Africa and Africans sheds light on key aspects of the Haitian Revolution, such as West Central African political ideologies and fighting styles, and the several African leaders who resisted the French and pushed Black revolutionaries to strive for independence. So therefore, my work looks to African descendants' micro-level activities that help to foster an oppositional consciousness during the colonial era that would become an important contributing factor to the beginnings of the Haitian Revolution. So chapter 1 begins with Africa and Africans, exploring the impact of racialization and commodification via the French slave trade at the Bight of Benin, Senegambia, and West Central African coastal societies, as well as the local attempts to escape, evade, and bring pause to the trade's destructive force. So we can think of African captives' resistance patterns, such as organizing around religion, marronage, and slave ship revolts as antecedents to the resistance that enslaved people undertook when they arrived in colonial Haiti. These patterns are important to unveil because mechanisms of racial capitalism attempted to erase the cultural, linguistic, regional, and political distinctions between Africans of various backgrounds. And through slavery and colonialism, the quote, Negro was born. As Haitian anthropologist Michel Rolfe-Triot has argued, this false idea of the Negro as inhuman, non-thinking, inferior to Europeans, and inherently enslavable has continued to shape the way scholars think about the slave trade, resistance, and the Haitian Revolution. So I ask, how did Africans understand the slave trade? How did their critiques of it inform how they understood the Middle Passage and plantation slavery in the New World? As Walter Rodney and others have pointed out, African kings, queens, and rulers consolidated economic and political power through the slave trade, while those who were most vulnerable responded with various methods of protecting themselves and their loved ones from the trade. In one example, I discussed the Dahomey Kingdom as an imperial power that conquered and enslaved the Fon-speaking Arada peoples at the Bight of Benin. Among the Arada were followers of the Vodun spirits who ruled forces of nature and also included ancestral figures. One of the major Vodun was Dongbe, a snake spirit that was considered part of the royal pantheon at the port city of Ouidah. When Dahomey conquered Ouidah in their 1727 campaign, they destroyed and ate the sacred snakes at Ouidah to demonstrate their hostility and military dominance over the Arada and their gods, as well as to undermine any social capital or political strength that could challenge Imperial Dahomey's dominance. So despite this defeat at Ouidah, members of the conquered Arada peoples who were exiled to colonial Haiti maintained a close relationship with the snake spirit, who was now Dangbala, and they became the progenitors of what would become the religion of Haitian Vodou, which later provided the social space and ideological solidarity for the Haitian revolutions beginning at the Bois Cayman ceremony of 1791. A historical background of Saint-Domingue within the wider context of European colonization is the focus of the second chapter, which frames the island originally known to the Taino as IT as a space defined by human commodification, death, and slave resistance since the first Africans arrived in 1503. Less than 20 years after their arrival, enslaved Africans were consistently escaping, taking up residence with the remaining Taino in the mountains and participating in organized revolts. The first African-led revolt in the Americas taking place on the island of Haiti in 1521. These rebellions were reactions to the brutal treatment of the Taino and Africans in the Comedia labor system, the emergence of the slave plantation-based sugar economy and processes of racialization, as well as the exorbitant death rates of enslaved people. The 16th and 17th century African rebellions also contributed to the downfall of the Spanish sugar industry, just as Black insurgency brought about the demise of the French sugar industry a century later. And then in examining the immediate social world of enslaved people, I also look at their social lives and recreation, particularly their cultural and spiritual creations, considering them as processes of enculturation that introduce new Africans to local idioms and modes of survival. Chapter 3 focuses on the spiritual world of enslaved people and the ways politicized consciousness and resistance were infused in ritual practices to repudiate the violence that undergirded slavery. This chapter is also theoretically guided by insights from the social movements field related to the politicization of social spaces and the role of cultural artifacts in social movements. So I frame spiritual and ritual gatherings as free spaces where participants' oppositional consciousness and sense of racial solidarity was enhanced by holding audience to anti-slavery and racial consciousness rhetoric, by employing spiritual technologies to protect oneself and attract good fortune, which usurped ultimate power from white plantation owners and asserted personal agency. And they used marronage to organize and recruit new ritual participants. So briefly here, I want to highlight a couple of examples that show how ritual work met the spiritual needs as well as build politicized solidarity networks among enslaved people and runaways. In 1768, a Congolese runaway named Pierre, who also assumed the name Dom Pedro, declared himself free and cultivated a following who traveled to various plantations of Petit Goave, performing rituals that induced a feverish dance induced by drinking rum laced with gunpowder. Pierre Dom Pedro is credited as the originator of the Patois tradition and site of contemporary Haitian Vodou. However, his influence was not only spiritual. He and 42 of his Black and mixed race followers were investigated by Judge Ferrand de Baudière for proclaiming enslaved people would soon be free and for spreading messages of rebellion and liberation from slave owners. Dom Pedro instructed the enslaved to protect themselves from being whipped by overseers and to instead use the whip against the overseers themselves. By 1773, several of Pedro's followers were still imprisoned in the jails of Petit Goave. In his wake, Dom Pedro became a label that was applied to any person who was known as a ritual leader who used, quote, sorcery to inflict harm or carried a large stick and a whip. Dom Pedro's repudiation and appropriation of the whip was both literal instruction about the non-ethical use of violence in slavery, but it also encouraged and prophesied slaves' reclamation of power against those who sought to keep them in bondage. Pierre Dom Pedro's ritual performances in Saint-Domingue probably took place during calendas, which were nighttime gatherings based on Angolan ceremonies that included counterclockwise circle dancing, drumming, and improvised call and response singing to invoke spirit beings. In Saint-Domingue, these gatherings also centered around the exchange of inkisis, which were small packages that carried the power of territorial and ancestral spirits to cure physical and spiritual ills. For example, the famed Maroon Francois Macandal was arrested at a calenda in 1758 for distributing poison inkisis to members of his network to use against their owners. Calenda participants also used the contents of the inkisis to imbue material objects with sacred power, namely large clubs called mayambo, which were used as personal weapons in martial arts styled stick fighting, which you see depicted in this image here. Nails were also inserted into the blunt ends of these sticks and for additional force and to indicate leadership within the network. A 1785 report from the Chamber of Agriculture stated that Cap Francais, one of the leading cities in northern colonial Haiti at that time, that the city had become a hotbed for calenda gatherings on weekends and on holidays. And at times, almost 2,000 Black folks converged on the city with their clubs and generally displayed acts of insubordination and hostility toward whites. One white man claimed that he chastised a group of Black men for making too much noise in front of his home. And he was met with the response that, quote, "the streets belong to the king," end quote, accompanied by a large rock being thrown at him, barely missing his face. In 1786, calendas were organized on coffee plantations in the Marmalade parish outside of Cap Francais. Four men, Jerome Pateau, Jean Ledot, Julien, and Telemaque, were accused of orchestrating these secret assemblies that frequently drew as many as 200 participants. In addition to facing charges for organizing the outlawed gatherings, witness testimonies asserted that the men were known for selling inquices and performing other sacred rituals using fruit leaves, rum, spices, nails, gunpowder, and pebbles to spiritually consecrate and protect themselves from harm or punishment. Jerome Pateau, a man of mixed racial descent, was chiefly responsible for selling the Mayambo martial arts sticks at the gatherings. He and Telemaque had previously been enslaved on the same plantation from which they both subsequently escaped. Another witness testimony stated that Telemaque had led a separate ritual assembly, and upon dispersal of that gathering, Telemaque threatened the witness's servant, saying, quote, "you think you're still in Go Naive, but you'll soon learn the power of the Negroes of Horn Island," end quote. The witness stated that the servant mysteriously died the next day of a violent colic, insinuating that Telemaque's supernatural abilities were responsible for the mortality. Telemaque and Jerome were also accused of preaching liberation and independence at the gatherings, attempting to instigate rebellion among the enslaved. While two of the organizers of the calendas were caught, Telemaque and Jerome were never captured, but ultimately hung in effigy for their alleged crimes. So in these cases of Dom Pedro and the calendas, seditious speech challenged both slavery itself and the power hierarchy of colonial society. These ritualists threatened white planters and their representatives, and in so doing, allowed ritual participants to understand the racialized nature of their oppression. The newly arrived African population likely would have welcomed such an articulation to facilitate comprehension of the new world into which they had been violently thrust and the superseding relevance of race over other forms of identity. So enslavement in Saint-Domingue constrained nearly every imaginable aspect of Bond's people's lives and was codified into law by the Code Noir. Africans and their descendants were coerced into accepting Christianity. They could not determine their work hours. They could not bear arms or buy or sell items at the market. And they were prohibited on paper, or officially at least, from participating in civil or criminal matters. Although these things did happen regularly. So oftentimes these laws and codes were flouted. Marriages between enslaved people generally were not recognized by children's slave status. And children's slave status was determined by that of the mother, meaning that parents had no reproductive rights over their children or their immediate family networks. So one way to mediate the penetration of these social controls or to disavow them altogether was through marriage. As I argued in my article that appeared in the Journal of Haitian Studies, Maroons escaped with their children, with their countrymen and women, or with people of other ethnic groups. They visited or hid with free or enslaved family members and loved ones. They leveraged their artisanal and language skills to pass for free. They stole food or clothing items to sell at local markets or to prepare for life away from plantations. They armed themselves with weapons to protect themselves from the Marche-Jusset fugitive slave police. They sought out existing Maroon communities, and at times they fled Saint-Domingue altogether to find refuge in the Spanish colony Santo Domingo to the east. Whether they were seeking to permanently escape or they needed temporary relief from the brutal plantation regime, runaways relied on knowledge, tools, resources, and relationships within their immediate grasp to facilitate their escape. So I conceptualize marronage in general terms as an act and a process of reclamation and redirection. When enslaved people moved about, voluntarily walking or running away from plantations, they not only made internal decisions regarding their reasons for leaving or to where or with whom they would escape, but runaways were reclaiming parts of their lives that were intended to be wholly and controlled and owned by enslavers. Intangible aspects of consciousness and identity and the labor value from the wealth produced in the colony were essentially extracted from enslaved people, including their cultural connections to a homeland, their time and energy, their sense of self and dignity, power and self-control, social relationships, and any equal usage of land and resources. Rather than accept the conditions of enslavement that proscribed social death and alienation, Maroons and their actions during flight initiated important changes in their daily lived experiences. By seeking out to maintain family ties, assuming African surnames or nicknames, toting guns or other weapons, forging free passes to obtain needed resources, mobilizing groups of people to escape together, or carving out geographic spaces in liberated settlements, Maroons reclaimed their identities, their energy, and their effort away from behaviors and actions that benefited the plantocracy and redirected them toward their individual, familial, or collective interests and needs. Marronage afforded a flexibility of movement, familiarity with the landscape, and maintenance or construction of social ties between Maroons, slaves, and free people of color that often diminished the differences between these categories of social actors. These groups were often in contact, and individuals could move between the states of being in marronage, slavery, and freedom at different points of their lives. So it was not impossible for an enslaved person to become a Maroon, return to slavery, and then become legally free. So I suggest that the fluidity between slavery, freedom, and quasi-freedom allowed rebels to use marronage to cultivate relationships that would lend to the 1791 revolt. To study marronage, the largest data source that I used came from content analysis of over 10,000 fugitive slave advertisements, mostly from the colonial newspaper Les Affiches Américaines. These ads are digitally archived in an open source, searchable online database, Marronage dans le monde atlantique, or Marronage in the Atlantic world. Runaway slave notices were a common way for slave owners throughout the Americas to locate and to reclaim their, quote, property. So the original intent of these ads was to surveil, track, and to re-enslave Black people. However, I aim to subvert these texts by discerning the ways in which runaways created or used previously existing social ties and other forms of their African Atlantic human capital to facilitate escape. The ads contain a wealth of demographic information such as runaways' age, their gender, race, or ethnicity, if they had any distinct physical characteristics, or labor-related or linguistic skills, and also for approximately how long they had been missing. So I should clarify that these advertisements don't necessarily reflect the total population of Maroons in Saint-Domingue. Most who escaped were quickly recaptured and jailed, and sometimes appear in separate prison rosters in the newspapers. At times, plantation managers failed to post a fugitive notice at all in order to save money, to keep ledgers from appearing unstable, or just out of sheer negligence. However, additionally, we also do not know the numbers of women who birthed children while living in self-liberated zones. So for example, in the Treaty of Manuel Maroons, who lived at the border between the French and Spanish territories, several families included adults and children who had been born free in the mountains. So the laissez-faire fugitive ads are but a window into the full population of runaways who had some modicum of success in freeing themselves. So chapters 4 and 5 of the book together examine these runaway advertisements that I analyzed, which yielded 12,857 observations or individual runaways that I coded by gender, age, and birth origin. The population of African-born runaways, who represented 2/3 of the entire runaway sample, they were labeled by their ethnic or geographic origin, while people who were born in the colony were described in racial terms. So Moreau de Saint Marie identified nearly 20 racial categories, Creoles being fully Black, Mulatts being half Black and half white, Griefs who were 2/3 Black, and Coterons who had one Black grandparent. Individuals brought to Saint-Domingue via the slave trade internal to the Caribbean were either described by the name of the colony or the European nation, such as the Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese, or English. Also, there was a small number of indigenous Caribs who were enslaved and escaped slavery alongside Africans. The vast majority of the sample were men over the age of 16, while adult women only made up 14% of the sample. So this supports speculations that women overall were less likely to permanently escape due to domestic responsibilities, but were more likely to return on a temporary basis and escape shortly thereafter. However, as my journal article in Gender and History also demonstrated, women did indeed bring their infants and young children with them. So motherhood was not a total impediment to searching for freedom. So for example, in this advertisement here on the left is announcing the escape of a Black woman named Bibian. It describes her as being from the Congo nation, so being of West Central African origin. It describes her physically and says that she fled Fort Dauphin as a Maroon, taking with her her Creole daughter named Gertrude. Creole meaning that her daughter Gertrude was born in the colony, and it describes her daughter as being 9 years old and asks for anyone who has information to reach out to Mr. Cordell in Fort Dauphin. And so this is just one example of not just the ways that that enslaved people and Maroons were described in terms of their ethnicity and racial identity, but it also gives credence to the ideas that that women took their children with them, valued their children, and valued family in general in terms of having a broader base of support and simply, human relationships, and demonstrating the importance of human relationships that the slave trade and plantations essentially undermined and in some cases destroyed. So based on my previous research and insights from social movement studies and Black study scholars like Sylvia Winter, I identified several thematic categories that indicated runaways' oppositional consciousness in the advertisements. So the first indicator that I used is the length of time that the runaway was reported missing, which helps me to distinguish between a permanent and short-term marronage. Presumed destinations were present when an advertisement mentioned that the person was seen in a particular area, or that they had family in a different district or a labor skill that allowed them to traverse the colony, or if they had some connection to people who were already Maroons. Self-assertive behaviors were the ways in which runaways made use of immediate resources to escape, such as stealing a boat, a horse, or money. They embodied a liberation consciousness by forging free papers or repeatedly escaping, and carried guns or machetes as protective weapons. And finally, I looked at runaways' use of social ties through escape within a group comprised of people from the same race or ethnicity, or by escaping in a group of runaways from different racial, cultural, and geographic backgrounds. Again, trying to kind of foreground and underscore the ways in which enslaved people and Maroons came to their own understandings of Blackness and solidarity around their shared conditions. The colonialism and plantation slavery were primarily geographic endeavors of conquering and staking claim to land and space. So rather than exclusively focus again on the transience or permanency of escape, that is to say these debates between Petit and Grand Marronage, chapter 6 argues that Maroons were spatially pervasive throughout Saint-Domingue, and that they employed their knowledge of geographic settings and geopolitical borders to subvert locations delineated for plantation development and imperial expansion. Mountains, sinkholes, caves, and rivers provided physical pathways for Maroons to secretly traverse the colony or to stake out hiding spaces. Nearly every region of colonial Haiti touched or was close to the sea, and having access to a body of water made boating or swimming away from slavery a tempting possibility. Runaways who were skilled swimmers had an advantage in Marronage. For example, an unnamed West Central African man threw himself from a schooner 3 leagues or about 10 miles from land and was suspected of reaching the northern area of Mont Saint-Nicolas, since his comrades attested that he was an excellent swimmer. Enslaved people who inhabited plantations near waterways had access to small boats and canoes that they used to escape. And others were canoe makers or masons, fishermen, or they were enslaved within the colony's naval forces. Dozens of runaways listed in the Laissez Americans advertisements were suspected of taking boats and using their maritime knowledge and experiences to escape, such as 3 sailors named Parrot, a Congolese man described as the captain, an English-speaking Nago man named Louis, and Azor, another Nago man, who together fled Le Cap in a stolen boat that was over 30 feet long. So chapter 6 also explains how the geopolitical border dividing French Saint-Domingue and Spanish Santo Domingo represented a form of cultural knowledge that Africans in Saint-Domingue exploited for well over a century by taking up arms against both empires and fleeing to Santo Domingo, seeking freedom from enslavement or better treatment and quality of life. For example, in the 1670s, the Spanish colony formed a town called San Lorenzo de los Negros de Minas to house Maroons that for over a century had attacked Spanish plantations. By the 18th century, it was suspected that hundreds of runaways from French Saint-Domingue had escaped to San Lorenzo to find safe haven as self-freed peoples. In chapter 7, I integrate findings from micro-level patterns of Marronage with macro-level conditions, and I examine how rates and the nature of Marronage changed according to these broader social, economic, political, and environmental factors. So this chapter argues that enslaved people were aware of the changing nature of their material conditions and sought to use societal contradictions and cleavages to their advantage in liberating themselves. So I give attention to the presence of the Marechaussee Fugitive Slave Police and the ways in which they did or did not successfully repress the presence and threat of Maroons in the colony. I also consider the evolution of Marronage and slave rebellion from the 18th century, the early 18th century, within the context of the exploding sugar and coffee industries, the expansion of the slave trade and the rapidly increasing African population, as well as structural cleavages and strains created by war and famine, as well as other environmental factors. So for example, during the War for American Independence, British ships placed a blockade on the American colonists, French allies in colonial Haiti, bringing the slave trade and other imports to a halt from 1776 until 1783. During that time, the colony also experienced extreme weather conditions, droughts followed by flooding, and food shortages. Several Maroons took this wartime strain as an opportunity to seek their own freedom through military service. In the early 1780s, several Maroons attempted to join the ranks of Count Charles d'Estaing, a former colony governor and French naval officer who led the siege on Savannah, Georgia in 1779 with troops of free men of color. An 18-year-old named Jean-Pierre was suspected of taking refuge in the French king's ships at the harbor. Others, including Sylvain, Michel, as well as two brothers, Jean and Jean-Baptiste Lefebvre, escaped their owners to attempt to board the ships of Count d'Estaing. Marronage during wartime did have some effect on royal policies. So rebellion, in addition to the food shortages, dry seasons, and flooding, prompted the King of France to impart an ordinance in December of 1784 to improve the quality of enslavement in the French colonies. Yet a short time later, plantation owners began to complain that, quote, the 1784 decree is fatal to the discipline and causes insurrections in our part of the province, end quote, indicating that enslaved people were again keenly aware of the geopolitics of their day and used them to their advantage. Maroons also had to strategically navigate state-sponsored repression from the Marechaussee Fugitive Slave Police. For example, one infamous Maroon leader, Noel Barochin, was known to coordinate the commanders of the work gangs as part of his network. One Marechaussee lieutenant claimed that when the Marechaussee captured and killed Noel in 1775, his two partnering factions, led by Kange and Boeuf, became embittered and aligned themselves into a single unit of over 1,500 Maroon rebels that then pillaged plantations in retaliation. So the final chapter focuses on the years preceding the Haitian Revolution and racial solidarity, the connections between enslaved people, Maroons, and free people of color during revolts and ritual gatherings. As I argued in chapter 1, enslaved people's collective consciousness emerged from their experiences as victims of the transatlantic slave trade and survivors of the Middle Passage. On the African continent, centralized political and economic power was increasingly associated with slaving, greed, injustice, and witchcraft, spawning forms of resistance that critiqued social, economic, and spiritual imbalances. Marronage, revolts, and religious formations were effective means of resisting the slave trade on the West and West Central African coast. Africans then carried these socio-political critiques and tactics with them across the Middle Passage or across the Atlantic Ocean to colonial Haiti, where African political thought, Marronage, and the coalescence of Haitian Vodou informed the revolutionary struggle of 1791. This was especially true with the Bois Caiman ceremony of August 1791, when Boukmandari, the Mambo priestess Cecile Fatiman, and delegates representing the enslaved masses from plantations across the Northern Plain plotted the demise of the sugar plantation economy and outlined the terms of their liberation. The real component of the gathering drew on a combination of Baida Benin and West Central African spiritual practices and deities, which ideologically and militarily cemented solidarity between Saint-Domingue's numerous ethnic groups. Women such as Cecile Fatiman also were important during the early days of the Haitian Revolution uprisings. They provided rebels with sacred protections, They traversed the colony, sometimes disguised as men, to assist with the revolutionary effort as couriers, spies, nurses, and smugglers. For example, Charlotte Papillon was the romantic leader of rebel leader Jean-François Papillon. She fled Cap Français in March 1791 and was suspected of reaching Port-au-Prince as late as that following August. It's not yet clear, what exactly she was doing or with whom she was in contact, but smaller uprisings did begin in the Port-au-Prince area that July. And by September, Charlotte was back north with Jean-François. So in the book, I kind of speculate about the types of role that she and other women played in possibly helping to coordinate these kinds of uprisings. So it was this kinds of solidarity between the formerly enslaved masses, Maroon leaders, and free people of color that appeared later during the 1802 Leclerc expedition as the Black population of Haiti collectivized the insurgency for the final fight for independence from France in 1804. And as a result, the first post-independence constitution declared that, quote, "the Haitians shall henceforth forward be known only by the generic appellation of Blacks," end quote, making Haiti the first and only free independent Black nation in the Americas. So the book's assertion that racial solidarity was forming as people took part in rituals and marronage has important implications for understanding post-independence Haitian national identity, which again by 1805 was explicitly equated with Blackness. Racial identity in the early modern era cannot be taken for granted as a social category. Right? It was created politically by the Code Noir and the 1805 Haitian Constitution, but it also developed through social norms and interactional processes. So though they were unified by race through national policy, old regime hierarchies based on class, skin color, and land ownership continued into the post-independence era, and in part led to a multiplicity of political formations in different parts of the island. What remained, however, was a sense of discontent and open aversion to any form of governance that resembled the exploitative social structures of the past, no matter the color of the person at the helm. So just to kind of briefly summarize and to kind of look at how I'm taking this project and kind of projecting it forward into upcoming works. I have a chapter coming out in the Debates in the Digital Humanities book series on fugitivities and futures, Black studies in the digital era. And this article kind of talks more about marronage and the ways that we can kind of use it as a lens to think about the digital humanities as a space that can advance liberatory ideas rather than replicate the kinds of racial and colonial formations that in many ways the digital sphere is kind of built on. Then I also have a chapter coming out in research and social movements, conflicts and change on racial capitalism and Black social movements. And this piece kind of looks at these ideas of racial capitalism grounded in the histories of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, and kind of uses racial capitalism as a framework to begin to understand and think about not only rebellions and other forms of resistance to slavery, but also how can we use racial capitalism to understand the motivations behind movements such as the civil rights movement, as well as the movement for reparations. And then lastly, I have a paper that will be coming out in the Journal of World Systems Research that looks at Maroon movements against empire, the long Haitian Revolution of the 16th through 19th centuries. And this paper is kind of condenses some of the arguments in the book and looks at the ways that marronage and revolts against slavery contributed to the downfall of the Spanish and French sugar industries in Haiti. So I think I'll end there. I think I've been talking for long enough, but I'm happy to answer any questions about rituals, runaways, and the Haitian Revolution, and any other topics and works that are in process. So thank you all so much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Awesome. If you guys have any questions or comments, drop them in the chat and I will read them and Dr. Eddins will respond. But I will open up with, I had a list of questions that I solicited from my colleague, Dr. Adam Thomas, who's with us on the webinar today as an observer, because he teaches this content. And I figured he was more familiar with the historiography than myself. If I could ask you to stop sharing, Dr. Eddins. So you've answered all of those questions that he shared with me. So I have a question to start it out. And it's related to the way I teach about the Haitian Revolution in class. And I have several students who are on the webinar. And I just gave this lecture Monday, I believe, in fact. And I framed it in the context of how the Haitian Revolution contributed to the causes of the US Civil War. And I framed it in the context of the Haitian Revolution led to the Louisiana Purchase, which led to the Missouri Compromise, which exacerbated tensions between slaveholding states and free states, that I'll say in air quotes, because those free states did have slaves as well. So my question is, what are the impacts of the Haitian Revolution in the Atlantic world?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think you pointed out, obviously, one of the major ones, especially here in North America. And I would say maybe an inadvertent result of the Haitian Revolution, which was the expansion of the cotton industry in the US South, right? But I think some of the more direct impacts that it had were the kind of influence and inspiration around Black freedom and Black liberation throughout the Caribbean, South America, and North America. And this was, and obviously we know the recently deceased Julia Scott talked about this in The Common Wind. The conversations that enslaved people and Maroons were having about the Haitian Revolution, about the potential of Black freedom and what that could potentially look like, was very much circulating throughout the Atlantic world. And so I think that these are really interesting. I mean, I think there's endless ways that we can, endless paths that we can follow in terms of where some of those conversations were taking place and among whom. And as you probably know, W.E.B. Du Bois, when he talks about the suppression of the transatlantic slave trade, he directly cites the Haitian Revolution as one of the causes of the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in 1807, 1808, in part in response to the fear of French Negroes, right, being imported, or Black folks from the Caribbean in general being brought into North American ports. And so I think there's a great deal of ways that we can begin to understand both the ways that the Haitian Revolution represented kind of a pivot for enslaved people in terms of the possibilities of freedom, but on the other hand, also a pivot for white slave owning plantation structures and colonial structures that sought to kind of recreate and identify new spaces of capital accumulation through slavery in other locations.
Indeed, indeed. And for my students out there and my graduate students who are listening, that W.E.B. Du Bois study began as his dissertation. I just want y'all to know how the work is the work, and it begins in humble places, but its impact is greatly felt. And that fear, I think it's important what you noted, right? That fear of, I'll say in air quotes again, to quote Thomas Jefferson, that fear of Haitianization of the North American slaves, right? For my students to tie it into my lecture. Now we have a question from the chat. This is from Kiera Harberberger. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. And the question is, were there any more names of maroon women who made an impact on the revolution? And were there any specific ways that women practice their spirituality?
Hi, Kira. Thank you for your question. So there were a handful of women who are named in, earlier archival sources as participants in the Haitian Revolution. Unfortunately, not quite enough, especially considering that essentially half of the enslaved population were women, and they were doing the exact type of work that men were doing. They were working in the fields, cutting and processing sugarcane, doing this really physically arduous work. And we know that many of these women came from African societies where women were soldiers, for example, at the Bight of Benin in the Dahomey Kingdom, where they had an entire military body composed of women. So in my mind, I think and believe that women were, fighting alongside men during the revolution. But we don't have enough of their names, but we do have some of their names, like Cecile Fatiman, Sanit Belair, who was the wife of Charles Belair, who was one of the Black military officers who fought against the French. Other women like Marie-Jeanne Lamartiniere, and another woman named, or who was nicknamed Dedi Defeli the La Fall. This was a woman who was, according to legend or oral histories, she was a part of the military camp of Jean-Jacques Dessalines. And after he died, she kind of recollected his body and buried his body. And so those are some of the notable women who were kind of known to have been a part of the struggle. And as far as some of their religious practices, other women whose names we may not necessarily know, they used some of their sacred practices within the religion of Vodou to keep secrets, to give sacred protection to the rebels, and to call upon spirit deities to give that kind of ideological and spiritual force for the fighting. So those are some of the kind of major examples of how women and religion kind of intersect during the early uprisings.
Awesome. And once again, for my students, when I gave the lecture about the preservation of African cultures in the Americas, and I told you that voodoo was Scooby-Doo and zombie island bullshit, and that is voodoo, or as Dr. Eddins pronounced it, that is an actual spiritual practice that comes from Africa, and this is not some Hanna-Barbera cartoon bullshit. It's important to emphasize that to the students. Dr. Dana Patterson, my colleague and director of the Intercultural Affairs Center, she has two questions that I'm going to combine into one. And it is, does Black religion still serve as a source of resistance? And what would that modern equivalent be? And then the second part is, why did you call the religious practices free spaces?
Sure, yeah, thank you for that, Dr. Patterson. I think that Black religion, across the Americas often has been cited as having a close relationship with resistance practices, especially during the era of slavery. So, for example, Vincent Brown talks about Obeah and some of the sacred practices during Tacky's Revolt. there's been work on Islam and its role in slave rebellions in Brazil. And so over the course, I think, of the early modern history in the Americas, enslaved Black people, I would say generally speaking, were able to kind of draw upon and recreate new forms of religious practices, and kind of infuse those practices with political ideology and political ideas more broadly. And this was because, for the most part, we know that enslaved people really did not have time to themselves like that. They didn't have much time to do anything leisurely, except for maybe having that one day a week to, cultivate their own gardens and then to worship. And so I call religious spaces free spaces because these were the times that Black people, enslaved Black folks and Maroons, were able to congregate without any white surveillance for the most part. They gathered at night, they gathered in the woods, they gathered in abandoned churches. They gathered wherever they could to cultivate not just these religious ideas, but also to plan revolt, to plan escapes. And so some of the modern equivalents, and this concept of free spaces kind of comes out of the sociology literature on social movements. So one of the major example, would be like the Black church during the civil rights movement, in the ways that, Alden Morris kind of talks about these churches and other Black institutions providing these spaces for mobilization and for organizing.
Awesome. I have a question from my student, Michael Smith. He's a really bright student. He don't say much in class, but he writes very well. And he has a question. Would you say that without African religion, the Haitian Revolution wouldn't have happened, or it would have been less likely? And because from what I've seen, basically from what Dr. Walton taught him, religion seems to be a very key part of a lot of resistance to slavery.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how well I could necessarily answer that, because all human beings have and develop religion, right? That's a part of how we understand like the world around us and understand who we are as human beings and our relationship to the world. And so there would be there wouldn't necessarily be any Africans without their religion or religious practices and sensibilities. But would the revolution not have happened without that religious solidarity? That's a great question. And I do think that if it had not been religion, there probably would have been other acts and other practices that had to bring people together. And I think religion and spirituality is for me in this project is not necessarily an end to itself, but a vehicle to understand how enslaved people came together. I think that's the most important part, especially when we remember that the transatlantic slave trade extracted folks from their homes, from various parts of the African continent, and threw them all together in this tiny island, where now people from areas from Senegambia all the way down to West Central Africa and even into Mozambique and Madagascar are now interacting with each other in ways that they probably never would have done on the continent, because the continent is so huge and geographically, these regions were so geographically distant from one another. And so really what I'm trying to kind of get at is to understand, how did people from these, vastly different spaces come together and form some type of and form networks, form spaces, and just form ways of collaborating with one another that then helped to prompt this rebellion and into a revolution.
Awesome, great answer. Okay, so our last question is coming from Dr. Thomas, Adam Thomas, and he asked humbly, because he's a very humble British guy. I know that's an oxymoron, So I hope Adam is laughing right now. But he asked, could you explain the significance of the image on the front of your book?
Yeah, can I share it again?
Oh, yes,
Actually,
ma'am.
okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so thank you for that, Dr. Thomas. So the book cover, let me pull it up again. The book cover is and I'll actually go to this one because it shows the image of it closer. So this painting is by a Haitian artist named Franz Zephyrin, and he was kind enough to allow me to use this image for the cover of the book. The painting is called The Slave Ship Brooks, and it is, depicting a group of rebellious Africans who are being punished by being kind of tied and chained to the outside of the ship. But as we see with these two figures who, according to Zephyrin, kind of represent Boukman and Toussaint Louverture, they've kind of broken their chains and they're kind of raising their fists in rebellion. And the ship, I'll go back. And so this kind of mermaid figure here is one of the Haitian Loa, or one of the Haitian spirits called Agwe, which is a spirit force kind of associated with water, but also with warfare. And so the image is kind of is indicating or showing these Africans, especially Louverture and Boukman, essentially bringing rebellion and bringing the revolution into the port of Cap Francais into Haiti. And so it's kind of emphasizing like the African influence of and traditions of rebellion that they brought with them to the colony even prior to 1791.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And I want to say lastly, before I thank you and let you go, my graduate students that are here, and I looked at the participants so I know which ones are here. Notice how Dr. Eddins, in presenting her book, and this is what I'm training y'all to do when it comes to historiography. She presented her subject, her thesis, her analytical paradigms and frameworks, her sources, her methodology, and how her chapters, individual thesi, reinforced and supported the book's overarching thesis. That is what you do in the historiographical entry, and those are the things you do in a historiographical essay. And of course, she gave us a summary of the content, which is not admonished in the historiographical essay, but that isn't the most important part of a historiographical essay. So take note, young Padawans, take note. Indeed, I want to thank you again, Dr. Eddins. It's a very important book. It's going to give value to multiple fields for many, 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 many years to come. And I'm just honored to know that I know you. And as Drake said, we started from the bottom, now we're here.
There it is. Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Walton. This was great. And I appreciate everyone who joined us tonight. And to those graduate students, y'all keep your head up. Like he said, this project started when I was in graduate school as well. And so these are ideas and topics that you'll be living with for a while and continuing to refine. So stick with it and hang in there.
Awesome.
Good luck.
Thank you again and have a wonderful night.
All right. Good night, everybody.